Well, good evening, everyone. I am so excited and privileged to be together with you all tonight. I love prayer meeting at South Bay. I've enjoyed every Tuesday first and then Wednesday evening we've spent together, and I'm very excited to share tonight. As Mr. Pratt already mentioned, I had the amazing opportunity and gift to spend 2 months in Israel this past summer. Most of that time I was in Jerusalem at the Seventh-day Adventist Study Center there in East Jerusalem, and I was studying biblical Hebrew. For 6 weeks, we covered basically the same material that the theology majors here at Southern cover in an entire school year. So that was an exciting ride. I really enjoyed it. And I'm actually continuing my studies in Hebrew this semester, and I'm taking intermediate Hebrew. So that has also been a great blessing. But this evening, I'd like us to focus on the house of David, a city, a dynasty, and a legacy. Back in 1993, a very exciting archaeological discovery was made up in the northern part of Israel in Tel Dan. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the expression from Dan to Beersheba. Well, this find was, or I should say, took place in Dan, in Tel Dan, and they found for the very first time actual solid archaeological evidence for King David and his dynasty. I believe it's here. I hope you can see my mouse, but here on this fifth line from the bottom, it specifically says that the Aramean king was fighting against the king of the house of Israel and the king of the house of David. Now, the specific kings in question were probably King Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah. But that isn't as important as the fact that on this piece of stone, which is housed in the Israel Museum, and I saw it with my very own eyes, is written the house of David. So now skeptics can no longer say, oh, David was just a mythological figure. He didn't actually exist. Yes, he did. And here is the rock solid evidence for that. Now, of course, we don't believe in the existence of King David because of this piece of stone. We accept him as a real historical figure because we accept the Bible to be true. And I would like us to take a look at the very first mention of David in the Bible, and that's in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 13. The context is the following. Saul is the king of Israel, but he has not been obeying God. And God sends the prophet Samuel on a special mission to go and secretly anoint David, the son of Jesse, to be the next king of Israel after Saul. And the Bible tells us, then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And this is the first time David is mentioned by name in the Bible. And I think this is very significant because the very first time David is introduced to us as a character, it is told, we are told that he was full of the Holy Spirit and that essentially that God was with him. And that is going to be important as we continue our discussion this evening. You can see there on the screen a picture of modern day Bethlehem, which of course is most famous for being the birthplace of Jesus, the Messiah, but it was also the hometown of David. And tradition says that right up here where this grove of trees is was the ancient site of the house of Jesse. You can take that or leave it. It's just tradition, but I just wanted to share that nonetheless. Well, in the very next chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, we are told the story for which David is, of course, best remembered. And this story takes place in the valley of Elah. So here is Bethlehem. You can see it here in the southern part of Israel. And slightly to the west is a very important valley, the valley of Elah. And this is a picture of that valley. And the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 17 that now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. And they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. The Philistine camp was somewhere right about here on these slopes. Please, someone tell me if you cannot see my mouse moving across the screen. This is the approximate location of the camp of the Philistines. Saul's men would have been camped somewhere here on this slope, and this valley was going to be the battle arena. What happens next? Well, of course, we know that the Philistines had a champion named Goliath, and he was taunting the men of Israel for 40 days. And when David, who was just a shepherd boy, heard the atrocities that Goliath was shouting against the God of heaven, he was indignant. And after getting permission from Saul, he ran to the brook, which you can actually kind of see here going through the valley. It kind of goes along here. David took 5 stones from the brook, and he ran to meet Goliath in the valley of Elah. Now, here are some sling stones that are also in the Israel Museum, and I wish I could tell you that these are the very stones that were in David's pouch that day, but of course they aren't. But that is probably about the size and shape that David's stones would have been. But what's more important is what are the words that David spoke to Goliath. And I know we've all heard them many times, but let's read them again and be encouraged. And I'm sorry, it says 1 Samuel 16, this should be chapter 17. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saved not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Wouldn't you agree with me that this is wonderful evidence that the Spirit of the Lord is upon David and is working on him? David has humility, he has courage, he has bravery, and that day God uses him to work a mighty miracle for the entire nation of Israel. Of course, we know what happens next to David. He spent the next 10 years or so as a fugitive, escaping Saul's wrath as Saul went farther and farther away from God's presence. Finally, though, Saul's days are numbered, and he gathers his army for battle against the Philistines one last time. This time in the northern area of Israel, in the Gilboa range. This is part of the Gilboa range today. And 1 Samuel 31 verse 1 tells us, "Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel." Doesn't that sound familiar? "And the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa." It's very interesting because even to this day, if you go and visit the mountains of Gilboa, the peaks and ridges are still named after Saul and his sons. This one here on the right is Mount Shaul, or the Mount of Saul. And this area here on the left is actually the hill of Jonathan. And if I remember correctly, some of the other peaks were named after the other sons of Saul who also fell in battle that day. 1 Samuel continues the tragic story and tells us that the next day, the Philistines found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off his head and put his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan, an important city that was just a few miles away. Now, I'd like to ask you, on the left, we have a picture of the Valley of Elah, and on the right, we have a picture from the area around Gilboa. Is there any great difference between these two landscapes? I would argue that no, there isn't a terrible difference. Both are semi-arid. The trees, the grass are basically the same. There's hills and valleys in both pictures. Both were the site of a battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. However, in the Valley of Elah, David was full of the Holy Spirit. He was humble and he was courageous enough for God to use him. But in the picture on the right, in the Gilboa Mountains, Saul was so devoid of the Spirit that he had visited a witch the night before and eventually ended up committing suicide in battle. So the difference between the two stories was definitely not the terrain. It was the presence in one case, or the absence of, in the other case, of the Lord. Continuing on in the story of David, after Saul's demise, David is finally crowned king. But he still has to wait 7.5 years before he becomes king over all of Israel. Finally, all of the tribes decide that, yes, we will accept David as king over all of us, and we are okay with being his subjects. During the 7.5 years that he was king over only Judah and Benjamin, David's capital city, of course, was the city of Hebron, which is slightly to the south. It is right here on the map where my mouse should be. But once he becomes king over united Israel, David seeks a new capital city, and we know which city he chose: Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been one of the most important cities of the world for the past 3,000 years. And of course, the top left picture is a view that I'm sure all of you have seen before, if not in person, then in pictures. It is a view of the old city from the Mount of Olives. And you can see the Temple Mount where Solomon's temple and later the temple of Herod would have stood. This is the eastern wall. This is the southern wall, and it continues a ways back, but basically in a straight line from what you can see here. And of course, the western wall is somewhere on this side. But of course, this is not what the city of Jerusalem would have looked like during the Old Testament period. The artist's depiction on the right is a view from the Mount of Olives during the time of Solomon, so approximately 970 BC when the temple was built. But even that picture is not what the ancient site of Jerusalem would have looked like when David and his men approached the city to conquer it. Of course, the current inhabitants of the city during the time of David were the Jebusites. And in order to imagine what David and his men would have seen as they approached the capital of the Jebusites, you have to completely erase Temple Mount, so this area here, as well as this big white palatial structure. You just have to take that away in your mind. And what's left, of course, is this little ridge of homes surrounded by this thick fortified wall. And that would have been approximately what the ancient city of Jebus would have looked like. And this is the city that came to be known as the city of David. There wasn't anything else in this area in approximately 1000 BC when David and his men were about to conquer their new capital city. Now, for you to get an idea for just how, actually, before we go there, I would just like to point out that the current site of the city of David is completely outside the walls of the old city as we see it and know it today. So essentially, what we call Old Jerusalem today is not really Old Jerusalem. It's the kind of intermediate Jerusalem. The genuinely old Jerusalem is this area right here, and I have other pictures that I will show in just a second. And this is the truly ancient capital city of Jerusalem. But now, just for scale, this is a model of first century Jerusalem during the time of Herod the Great and shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem in 66 AD. Now, the pink part that I have circled, that is the city of David. And you can see it there. So this bigger picture is approximating the view from the Mount of Olives. We are looking towards the west. So we're looking at the eastern wall here. Here's that southern wall, and the city of David is off to the south. So this was tiny compared to what Jerusalem would eventually grow into during the first century. Here is a side view standing from approximately here. You can see what a tiny little ridge the ancient capital of the Jebusites was built upon. This was a tiny, tiny place, but that's just the way things were back almost 3,000 years ago. Everything was much smaller than what we envision as a big, important city today. And again, notice that the city of David is entirely outside the old city walls of today, which go somewhere right along here following the southern wall of the Temple Mount. Now, I'd like you to keep this upper right picture in mind as I flip to the next one, because this is what the city of David looks like today. Here you can see the southern wall of the Temple Mount and of the old city. And this kind of triangle that's not super well defined, that is the current city of David. Sometime during the past 2,000 years, it was buried and actually lay undiscovered until 1867. Since then, however, there have been extensive archaeological excavations happening there. When I was there, I believe there were 4 digs all happening at the same time in that tiny little area because there's so much history there. But now, not to go too deep into the all the details of archaeology, let's go back to David and to his men. How did they conquer the city of the Jebusites? The Jebusites prided themselves on having an impregnable fortress. As you can see, it was built on a ridge with steep slopes on 3 sides. And to top it all off, it had an extensive water supply in the Grakov spring, which was the most important water source in the area. And that was what fed the capital of the Jebusites. Now, Jerusalem is not that far from Bethlehem. So David had grown up in this area, and he very likely knew that the Gihon Spring, while being one of Jerusalem's greatest assets, also had the potential to be its greatest weakness. Now, the Gihon Spring is here on the, well, I don't know what direction to call it, but anyway, it's here, almost all the way down into the valley. And the Jebusites were very smart. They built a guard tower to protect the Gihon Spring in case of attack. They didn't want to bring the city walls all the way down and make the Gihon Spring part of their city, because that way they would lose the advantage they had from being up high on top of the hill and forcing an enemy to climb up to meet them. So of course they didn't want that, but they also had to somehow protect their water supply. So their very clever solution was to build a guard tower, which you see here depicted around the area of the spring. And then they connected the guard tower with the rest of the city up on the hill with actually an underground tunnel. And that way, the inhabitants of the city, whether there was an army encamped outside or not, they could just go down through the tunnel, go underground, and eventually come out inside the guard tower, fill their containers with water, and then go back up the tunnel staying the whole time underground and not exposed to any enemy assaults that might be happening outside. However, David probably knew about all of this. And these pictures are actually from that tunnel that the Canaanites, the Jebusites, had built for this purpose. I'm not sure exactly how long it is. Maybe, well, actually, I'm not going to make any estimates because I'll probably get it wrong. But as you can see, visitors to the city of David can still walk all the way through it and experience what it would have been like to be a Jebusite going up and down to get water. But anyway, David probably somehow knew about all this, and so he slyly dropped a hint to his men. And in 2 Samuel 5, verse 8, it says, "And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind," his nickname for the Jebusites based on their claim that the city only needed the lame and the blind to defend it. No one else was necessary. Anyway, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind through the water tunnel. Now, of course, we don't know for sure how David and his men captured the city, but it is quite possible that they stormed the guard tower and then rushed up through the tunnel and into the city and captured the stronghold that the Jebusites were sure could not be captured. So that I thought was extremely interesting. It was certainly one of my favorite experiences there in the city of David. And here are the remains of the guard tower that the Jebusites had built. I'm sorry, these pictures are not very clear. It was kind of dark. But you can see there where the screen has dropped an artist's imagination of the perspective. So if you're standing at the guard tower looking up at the city walls, and again, this is very similar to this picture where the guard tower is here, and in this picture you're looking up those, I don't know what to call them, those staircase type walls. Here are those staircase type walls going up to the city walls. Of course, we don't know exactly how it looked, but based off of the archaeological evidence, this is probably a very helpful way for us to imagine. Now, this is the pool that the Grakov spring was made to flow into. This is the pool that the guard tower was protecting. And this is where the Jebusites would have come and filled their containers with water. And this pool was continued to be used by the Israelites all the way until the days of King Hezekiah. Solomon was crowned king here by the Gihon spring. In 1 Kings chapter 1, it tells us, so Zadok the priest went down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and brought him to Gihon. There Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. So this is where Solomon was crowned. Now, let me just go back to this picture. This big white structure obviously doesn't stand in this form today, but the foundation of that structure was uncovered back, I don't remember what decade, but sometime in the 1900s. It is at the northern end of the city of David. And archaeologists think that this may be the foundation of the palace of King David. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the evidence for and against this. I think it's quite fascinating, but unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about that right now. But I think that even if this wasn't exactly King David's palace, it was certainly a palace of one of the kings of Judah. Now, the picture on the top right, Those are some of the decorative capitals that would have been part of this palace. And the originals are in the Israel Museum. And I got to see them there. But anyway, I will kind of skip over this for now because there's something else I would like us to get to. So David was well established as king, and because, unlike Saul, he was obedient to God, his house was established. And so we have the house and the dynasty of David. And now we're going to skip over about 300 years of Israelite history. Excuse me. Now, on the throne of Judah, we have David's great grandson, Hezekiah, on the throne. Now, from what the Bible tells us about Hezekiah, he was an excellent king. He reinstituted the Passover and encouraged his people to worship God. He cleansed the land of idols and just was a very godly and committed king in general. After going through a couple of chapters describing all of the good and commendable things that King Hezekiah did, 2 Chronicles 32 starts out like this. After these things and these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them for himself. Let's stop right there. After these acts of faithfulness, Hezekiah had been doing everything right, and still this massive threat came and assaulted his kingdom. So the first lesson that I get out of the story is just because we are doing our best and seemingly doing everything right doesn't mean trials are not going to come. Sometimes trials are meant to wake us up and shake us out of some stupor that we may be in, but other times they are just meant to develop faith and spiritual muscle in us. Trials come to all of God's children, and here they came to good King Hezekiah. What was his response? Let's continue the story. And Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem. He set to work resolutely and built up all the wall that was broken down and raised towers upon it. And outside it, he built another wall, and he strengthened the Millo in the city of David. He also made weapons and shields in abundance. Now, just remember that this picture here is a view of Jerusalem from the days of Solomon. We are now almost 300 years after the times of David and Solomon, and the city of Jerusalem had expanded. Particularly, it had expanded westward. So here, this area was now part of the city of Jerusalem. And before the Assyrian threat, that area of the city had not been very well protected. But now, when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib intended to fight against Jerusalem, he repaired all of those fortifications. And it says that he completely built the wall around Jerusalem. And not only that, but he also built a second wall so that it would be even stronger and more resilient to attack. Hezekiah also did something else, though. It says he planned with his officers and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. A great many people were gathered, and they stopped all the springs and the brook that flowed through the land, saying, "Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water?" Hezekiah probably remembered the story of how his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather David had conquered the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and he determined not to let the water source be his downfall too. So what Hezekiah decided to do was almost literally to move the Gihon spring so that it would no longer be down and outside of the city walls, but inside. So what exactly did Hezekiah do? He built a tunnel from the spring so somewhere right about here, he built a tunnel from the spring to a pool that was well within his new fortifications. So the tunnel winds underneath the city through the mountain. From here, it goes under the city, and then it empties into this pool. Now, I know that in this picture, this pool looks entirely unprotected, but by the time of Hezekiah and the expansion of the city, that pool would have been well within the walls of the city and would have been quite protected and quite a safe location. So just try to picture that while extending even further south and encircling that pool as well. And the result of all these exertions was Hezekiah's tunnel. It was carved in 701 BC, and it is all of 1,749 feet long. And it is an engineering wonder that still continues to perplex scientists today. As we already mentioned, the tunnel winds under the city of David for 1,749 feet. And now just picture this. Every piece of rock, and this is solid rock, was chiseled out by hand. So you have the chisel in one hand, the hammer in the other, little piece of rock a few inches big comes off, repeat, repeat, repeat for 1,700 feet. Can you imagine? And this tunnel was intended to guide the cold, fresh water of the Gihon Spring slightly downhill into that new pool that was well protected by the city walls. The amazing thing is that the water still flows today. And if you visit the city of David, you can actually walk the entire length of Hezekiah's tunnel. I had the amazing opportunity to go through it twice. And it was one of the most incredible things I did in Jerusalem, not just because it was fun to splash through that cold water. It is cold and it is clean and clear. It is beautiful water. If people weren't walking through it all the time, I would definitely consider drinking from it. It is really nice water. But anyway, it is just incredible to walk through this tunnel, even though it is pitch black. You have to wear a light. Because just going through there and imagining the workmen of Hezekiah with their hammers and chisels standing in that very same space and in that very same tunnel and just working diligently, tiny piece of rock after tiny piece of rock, just chipping away to protect their city from the Assyrians. It really is an incredible experience. There was an inscription. Well, I don't know if I should say is or was, but there, the workmen of Hezekiah actually left an inscription commemorating their achievement and their work. And there's a very long story about all of the politics behind the removal of the inscription, why it is in the Istanbul Museum in Turkey today. Anyway, we won't get into all of that right now. But this inscription tells us how the men of Hezekiah built the tunnel. There were two teams of workers. One started at the spring end, the other started at the pool end, and they both wound their way through and eventually met somewhere in the middle. And the inscription tells us that when they were several cubits apart, they could finally hear each other's voices through the rock. And I'm sure they very joyfully and excitedly finished those last few feet of rock between them, and the tunnel was complete. Experts still puzzle over how the tunnel was engineered. For example, how did the workers have enough oxygen for their lights and to breathe? This is a very long tunnel. It was very deep underground. It was chiseled in solid rock. How did the workers survive? And how did even their torches stay on? How did they build a tunnel over 1,700 feet long to be so perfectly level that the difference between the two openings is only a few centimeters. Also, Hezekiah and his men managed to build the tunnel in very little time because, after all, the Assyrians were coming and nobody knew exactly when that was going to be. The most generous estimate is that it took Hezekiah's men about 2 years to build the tunnel, and others say it only took them about several months. And of course, the Second Chronicles and Second Kings also confirm that the tunnel was built during the days of Hezekiah. It just doesn't use the word tunnel, but otherwise it is very clear. And in Second Chronicles 32, it says, "This same Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David." 2 Kings 20 tells us, "The rest of the deeds of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made the pool and the conduit," there's a tunnel, "and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah?" It's really amazing to see how the Bible and archaeology come together in this story. And until he visited the city of David and walked through the tunnel of Hezekiah, I never actually understood the level of painstaking effort that Hezekiah and his subjects applied to their preparations for Assyrian siege. It's easy to read 2 Chronicles chapter 32. Oh yeah, they built the wall, they made extra weapons, they did this and this and this. But actually seeing and being able to touch and walk through these preparations and these feats that have lasted for almost 3,000 years really opened my eyes to see that Hezekiah truly did everything that was in his power to do to prepare. Here's the best part, though, and let's pick the story back up in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. "And he set combat commanders over the people and gathered them together to him in the square at the gate of the city, and spoke encouragingly to them, saying," pause. What do you suppose Hezekiah said to his people? Do you think he pointed them to the double wall that they had just finished building? Do you think he reminded them that they had increased the fortifications and built towers all around the city walls? Do you think he pointed them to that tunnel that they had just finished carving out of the solid rock to bring fresh water into the city at all times? Do you think he talked to them about the abundant weapons and shields that they had all produced together? All of that was true. They had done all that, but it's not what Hezekiah pointed his people to. The rest of the verse tells us, "He spoke encouragingly to them, saying, 'Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him, for there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God, to help us and to fight our battles.' And the people took confidence from the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah." To me, this is absolutely incredible. Hezekiah's ultimate trust was not in anything that he had done, but was entirely on what God could and would do for his people. Hezekiah correctly understood the balance between faith and works, which is something that I know I have struggled with and sometimes continue to struggle with, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Hezekiah did everything he possibly could to prepare for the siege, and these preparations have lasted for 2,700 years. But he put his trust in the Lord for the final deliverance. And we know that God came through for Hezekiah and the people of Judah. Shortly after the Assyrians arrived, because they did come, 185,000 of them were struck dead without a battle. In closing, the legacy and the lesson from Hezekiah's tunnel is this: God's blessing is not limited by our efforts, but his blessing can be poured out that much more when he has efforts to bless.